And as we do that, I'm going to ask ask all of you if you have ever applied or dealt with a pesticide.
Yes, I remember that.
Carol has, yeah. Jonathan, what about you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Amanda? You have, okay. Next question. Did you read the label before you did it?
No.
No? Carol?
No, not on the 7 dust.
That's
It's read what it does. And
that's not unusual.
and that it's
But-
safe around. It's safe around like food plants, crops. That it wouldn't kill you if you ate the tomato. That had some. I mean, you would wash it off first, but it said it wasn't harmful or kill the tomato plants type thing.
Okay. And that response is a typical response for folks that have read a label. And that's what this chapter 3 is talking about is labeling. And if you don't get anything else out of this class, I want you to remember this one statement. The label is the law. And for all practical purposes, that is one of the more important things that you deal with. And a label on any sort of product, whether it be an aerosol spray that you're concerned about spraying for ants or wasps, or whether you've got 7 dust that you're going to put on your beans, or try to control Japanese beetle with. That's the label is a primary consideration as we look at that. So it gives you the basic instructions and precautions that are to be used. I got that one on back here.
I was wondering what that light was out there.
Got the basic instructions and precautions for the use of a chemical. And we're going to, like I have done for the past two chapters, we're going to look at some terms, some terminology, so we all get on the same playing field as we begin to talk about the label. Because there's some terms here that are key to understanding a label and understanding what is involved with that. So the first one is the term active ingredient. And the active ingredient is the chemical in a pesticide product that affects or controls the target pest. And it varies. With active ingredients, you've got certain ingredients that are designed to control insects, some that are designed to control diseases, and some that are herbicides. So the active ingredient is the goodie, so to speak, that we talk about. The next term, and these are always listed in alphabetical order, and it may not be actually on the list of their importance as far as the chapter is concerned. But acute effects are illnesses or injuries that appear within 24 hours after the exposure to a pesticide or a combination of pesticides. The acute effects are the ones that are more immediate. The delayed effects are things that occur more than 24 hours after the exposure.
Wouldn't the acute effect be something like you get it on your skin and it causes a rash within 5 or 10 minutes?
That would be an example of an acute effect. Yeah. And some of it could be a respiratory effect. If we're dealing with certain organophosphates, they are a poison that affects the cholinesterase, or the chemical that's involved in the human or in mammalian movement. Cholinesterase is essential for the nerves to act. So if you get an overexposure of a material that affects cholinesterase, you begin to lose the focus on your eyes. Your pupils become either pinpoint or dilated. You'll have respiratory issues. You may have mobility issues. You may begin to stagger. Sometimes you might have convulsions or vomiting.
Somewhat exposure to nerve gas.
Well, in essence, Tyler, you use the term nerve gas. That's what a cholinesterase inhibitor is. But a nerve gas is much more concentrated. It has a definite purpose of debilitating something. So, but when we're talking about a delayed effect, we're talking about things that are over a long period of time as opposed to acute effects. So, and you mentioned immediate skin reaction. I've been using a material in the grapes at home, which the commercial name of it is oxidate, but I've been using a generic material called HDH proxy, which is hydrogen dioxide as opposed to hydrogen peroxide. In other words, it's missing one oxygen. So it's just a dioxide. And that is a material that's actually an antibiotic. It's a bactericide. And I'm using it to curtail rot in the grapes that we've got. But that material, if you get it on your skin, it will begin to burn immediately.
Define burn, as in like physical burn?
Physical burn, like it hurts.
Oh, no. Okay.
And it's not going to blister or anything initially, but it will create if you just get a drop or two on your finger, it creates a white lesion that takes away the normal pigment out of your skin, and it will have to regrow before that. It actually kills the cells around the point where you touch it.
Really?
So that in its concentrated phase is pretty dangerous.
And you splash that stuff on your forearm or something, you're looking at some.
It'll hurt. It'll hurt. I got some on my hands last year. I haven't done it this year. I've been real cautious with it. But that's an acute effect because it happens immediately, but then there's secondary effects that occur later. So talks about allergic effects. They are harmful effects such as skin rash or asthma. An asthmatic situation is an allergy to something. And it varies with people as to their allergic effects of most of these things. So,
Asthma is a terrible thing.
believe me, I understand. I know exactly what it is. The brand name is the trademark name given to a pesticide by the manufacturer. It often includes the formulation or information about the formulation and the percentage of active ingredient. An example of a brand name would be 7, 50% WP. Do what?
I said, what is that?
All right, that's what we're going to talk about. 7, if that is the brand name that we're talking about, 7 would be the brand name. The 50% would be the concentration of the active ingredient that is in that particular formulation, and the WP, which are things that we're going to be talking about, stands for wettable powder. And there are all sorts of formulations of 7 as we talk about. There is a 7 that is a 2% dust, that people can use, just dust the material on their beans or whatever. The 2% material is actually only 2 pounds of the active ingredient of 7, which is N-methyl carbamate. That's 2% of that. In other words, it would be 2 pounds of that compound in 100 pounds of formulated product. Now, sometimes there's a 5% 7, which means you had 5 pounds of the active ingredient in 100 pounds of the product. So, you know, there's some reason to the way that these things are outlined. But we'll spend a little time talking about concentrations and these abbreviations because they get pretty involved. The chemical name is the technical name that identifies the chemical formula and structure of a pesticide's active ingredient. And what I just gave you a while ago was N-methyl carbamate. And that is the chemical name for 7. 7 being the brand name, and the N-methyl carbamate is the chemical name. Now, the common name, which is this can get a little confusing to you. And it's a short name given to the pesticide's active ingredient that is officially accepted by the EPA. And in this situation, we're talking about carbaryl. And carbaryl is the common name. So if you're talking about 7 or N-methyl carbamate or carbaryl, we're talking about exactly the same chemical. They're just 3 different ways of dealing with it, 3 different names of identifying it. And as we talk about that, the chemical name, the brand name, and the common name are all going to show up on the label somewhere. The actual formal label that is affixed to the package that you purchase. So, we'll try to give you some more definitions or explanations of that as we move along. One of the things that we need to make sure you're aware of is something called the establishment number. And the establishment number is pretty much what it says. It's a number that is given to a particular chemical that identifies the establishment where it was produced, or the factory where it was produced. Because there are chemical companies all over the United States, all over the world. But every manufacturing site has an establishment number. And it's a mechanism that the EPA and everything uses to track where chemicals are made. And if there was ever a potential problem with a formulation or something, they'd be able to use this establishment number that appears on the label to track it back to its point of origin. Now, the establishment number means where it was done, and the registration number is an identifying number assigned to a pesticide when it is registered by the EPA. So the identifying number that occurs on the label is the registration number, and where it was made is the establishment number. So then these two things will come up as we move along. So as we look at a label, we talk about the brand name, chemical name, and common name. That if we're looking at the one, for example, 7, 50% wettable powder, you've got 50% of the good stuff, 50% of the active ingredient in there. The remaining 50% is what we call inert ingredients.
I'm guessing they're just there as placeholders to keep the whole thing stable.
Well, not so much stable Tyler, that's you're swinging at the purpose of it.
Filler?
Filler is exactly what it is. If you had, for example, 7 and had it formulated in 100% material, it would be hard to handle. It would be hard to apply, hard to mix, and would be much more, be a greater potential for it to cause harm. So that's the reason it's formulated in that manner, so that you can actually weigh it out and put it in a tank and be able to spray it on. So if we're talking about 50% 7, you've got 50% good stuff and 50%, as you said, carrier, or inert. If we had 7 dusts that we're talking about that's available to put on your beans or your garden products, and we had it in a 2% material, what would be the inert ingredient percentage?
It was 2%, 98%.
98% would be inert, right. That's what we're talking about. So, look through this a little bit. All right. If I ask you what a label was, how would you respond?
It's like
Usually what?
a sticker on a product, or like it says what the product is, like in a
Yeah. You're exactly right, and there are a lot of different components to a label, and we're going to spend a lot of the time today talking about what those components are. But that's what we're meaning. The label is the printed material that is attached to or part of the pesticide container. That's why I asked you guys if you'd ever read a label, because I know you've all used wasp spray or sprayed for ants or treated the garden with something. So put something on your roses. So that had a label on it, whatever it might have been. So what's the difference in the term label and labeling?
Labeling is the process of actually making the label and putting clear instructions for the user to use, and the label is the finished product of that.
Yeah, that's a pretty good idea. Yeah, the labeling is the process, the legal process that is required by the federal government to enable you to be able to use a product. So that's what we're talking about with label. All right, I'm skipping around a little bit to try to create a little continuity in this discussion. So, a pesticide handler or handling of a pesticide is the person who works with or is the process of working directly with the pesticides. They're performing routine tasks such as mixing, loading, and possibly applying a pesticide. It's working with pesticide equipment. So a handler or a handling, two different terms. The handler is the one that does it. The handling is the act of applying or working with the pesticide. So, and that brings about the possible discussion of what we call personal protective equipment. That's another one of these that has an acronym of PPE. And that's a device or clothing used or worn to protect the human body from contact with pesticides or pesticide residues. And now the PPE, the protective equipment, is going to vary dependent upon the toxicity and the type of material that we're dealing with. And we'll spend a little time talking about that. And I've got a old bag of PPE in the office, and I'll try to remember to bring that over here when we come back on Wednesday, because this is a good time to talk about it. There is a term that we've talked about very briefly called restricted use pesticide, and that's any material classified for restricted use by the EPA, and it restricts the product, its uses, to and use by a certified pesticide applicator, whether it be commercial or private, or under the direct supervision of a commercial or certified applicator. When I ask you the question about labeling, Josh, you don't have a private pesticide license, do you?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, that's the reason I ask. I don't think any of you have a private license. So, if you go to southern states and want to buy Mustang Max. Mustang Max is a pyrethroid that is an insecticide. Real good material, has a real short life, and you can use it to apply it today and harvest whatever you put it on tomorrow. But it is still categorized as a restricted use material. So if you were to go to southern states and ask them for that, their first question would be to you, do you have a pesticide license? And if you responded no, they'd say, well, I can't sell you that. It's limited to folks with a pesticide license. So that's how restrictive, or how the law views the sale of restricted use materials. And the restricted use is regulated by the toxicity of the material, whether it be to the applicator or to the actual target pest. And it is also affected by environmental situations. There are a couple of materials that were widely used in the production of corn several years ago. They're better and newer materials now, but atrazine and simazine were two materials that have been used to control weeds in sweet corn or in any type of corn. And they had been overused to the point that they were not initially restricted, but because of soil and water contaminations, they were placed on a restricted list some time ago. And you have to prove that you are trained and skilled by holding a pesticide license before they'll let you buy those anymore. And they're not toxic. There's not a problem with them. But there are certain places where the overuse of those have shown up in groundwater and created some secondary effects. So with that in mind, they've placed those two materials on a restricted use list. And, they're not harmful at all. You can wash your hands in them. Won't hurt a thing. So, but that's just an example of one of the things that's come about with changes in that classification of stuff. All of the materials that are available for sale with a label have to go through some sort of registration process. And that registration process is time consuming and cumbersome. If a chemical company comes up with a material that they think may be of value, say to control a particular type of weed, they will have to go through extensive laboratory and greenhouse tests. Sometimes that may take 2 or 3 years. Then they'll have to go through another battery of testing where they'll do it field tests. And when you're doing field tests on a particular thing, if you're just doing it here in the United States, it's going to limit the number of it's going to what? No, it's going to extend the process because you're going to have to go through several growing seasons. So that's one reason that the major chemical companies that are testing stuff, they'll test stuff in our end of the world, in northern hemisphere, during the summer, and then they'll go to the southern hemisphere and test it during what would be our winter, trying to gain another year's data, because they'll have to have 5 or 6 years of data about the efficacy or the effectiveness of a particular chemical on as they work towards registration. Quite often it'll take somewhere between 10 and 15 years from the inception of a chemical to its availability for sale.
Ooh.
So with that, it's made it extremely expensive to develop new materials. With that in mind, a chemical company has to be aware that with all these extensive costs, they're going to only pick materials that have a wide use, that are going to be used on large acreage or large volume or large or high dollar particular chemical crops. So it makes it really expensive, and it was bad 20 or 25 years ago, but it's gotten a lot worse now because just the cost involved in doing it. Quite often they will pay a university or two to do the initial field tests, and once they go through that successfully, they'll take the product to, say we're talking about apples. They'll have some in the Shenandoah Valley in actual grower tests. They'll have some possibly in the Roanoke area. They may have some in the Patrick County area, and then they'll have some down in North Carolina to gain as much exposure. But yet, that's one of the things that's involved with the registration process of gaining new chemicals. And there's been a lot of effort and work done over the last number of years to try to find products that have minimal risk to both the environment and the applicator. And they are low-risk products, and some of those actually get exempt from federal registration if it can be proved that they have no risk to the environment or the applicator. One of the materials that they've used is a fungicide to curtail mildew on an assortment of crops. It was found, and I don't know how they did it, but they harvested a particular spore from a mold and found that mold would actually reduce the incidence of mildew on an assortment of crops. But the fact that it was a naturally occurring mold and wasn't a product of a chemical manufacturer that was naturally occurring in nature, they didn't have to go through all these processes to do that. So it sort of was fast-tracked through the registration process, and it is now there. But can you imagine trying to harvest enough spores off of mold to make a volume of material that would be available for sale?
That would be a very time-consuming and costly process.
Time-consuming and costly, and the fact that it was not restricted use meant that anyone could buy it. So it was potentially a lot larger market. So it's just some of the things and the details that we have to deal with when we're talking about agricultural or chemical use in general. So that's a lot of the terms that we need to be aware of. Well, there's a few more here on the back. I didn't turn this over. when we're talking about a label, labels have what we call signal words on them. And if we're talking about just a general pesticide label, you're going to have either the word caution, warning, danger, or danger-poison. And those are what we call the signal words. They are in bold letters on the very front of the label. And a caution type label is the least dangerous of those. Technically, the salt that you put on your French fries is more hazardous to you than the materials that have the caution label on.
How is salt more dangerous?
Because
Salt, it can be toxic.
it can kill you, yeah. If you just eat a bunch of salt by itself.
Oh, I mean, yeah, if you just gorge yourself on it, dry you out.
Well, that's what we're talking, and that's exactly what I mean. Salt is more dangerous, potentially more dangerous than the agricultural chemicals that have the term caution. Okay? That's all I'm getting at with that. Go ahead, Carol.
I said that's just wild to think about that, but you know.
Well, it's, and there's some, we'll see some more information on that when we get into this a little farther, but that's trying to put it in context so you'll understand it is what I'm doing with that. Now,
Fear the salt.
huh?
I said fear the salt.
Well, that's just an example. You deal with salt every day. You may not deal with an agricultural chemical every day, but the salt is more hazardous than a lot of the ones that have caution written on.
I mean, that was a good example. That's a good example.
Well, these are things that sometimes it's a little hard to bring home to you. So that's just one that we're talking about. All right, the next category are chemicals that have the term warning on them. They are more hazardous than the ones that are the category that's listed as caution, but not as bad as the ones that's listed with danger. So the warning and danger are sort of in the middle of the range. And if you see one that's got danger/poison on it, that's the more toxic. And quite often that one is accompanied by a skull and crossbones, so that you can visually recognize that one is the more toxic cat.
Can kill you.
Well, any of them can kill you with their misuse or abuse, but that one is
Or more likely to if mishandled.
yeah, and it won't take near as much of that one as it will, some of the others. Okay. Now, as we talk about these, we talk about the different categories of toxicity. The term tolerance comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually usually something that means the amount of a pesticide residue that may remain on a food or feed product at harvest or when the animal is slaughtered. And all of the chemicals that we talk about will have a tolerance. Means that there will be they're acceptable, and there's a legal amount that will be tolerated, basically, without any red flags to the EPA or the consumer. It's the amount that has been legally determined to be harmless, so you don't have any detrimental effects. Occasionally, we'll have a pesticide that is labeled for a particular use, a particular crop, and there may be a special circumstance that occurs, and they may have to do what they call create a supplemental label. And that's a term that's used by the EPA for labeling that describes newly approved usage or changes in the product label. Several years ago, when the marmorated stink bug, brown marmorated stink bug appeared, there were not any real chemicals that had the brown stink bug listed on the label. And stink bug was a potential, a real problem. Say on my grapes, for example, there was a high population of those bugs that just appeared, short period of time at the end of the growing season, and they would love to feed on grapes or fruit products that were ripening, and nothing labeled to apply for the stink bug. So there was a supplemental label applied for and granted to specifically target the stink bug in that situation. They got it for several pyrethroid type insecticides that would be used to knock the population of that stink bug down. What they do is about this time of year, we're getting ready to harvest grapes, and we have an invasion of the stink bug. And are y'all familiar with what I'm talking about with the stink bug?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Reaction. Yeah, they're nodding their heads, being nonverbal, but yeah, they know.
Okay, that's fine. Well, what would happen, and I know of this particular situation, there was one winery that was trying to be extremely cautious about what they put on their grapes and so forth. So when that stink bug invasion came, they thought, well, I'll just go on and harvest them and it won't be any problem. But they had enough of a population of stink bugs in those grapes when they harvested them. And if you're not familiar with what happens to grapes, that you harvest them and you take them and put them in a big machine that crushes the grapes and squeezes the juice out. But with the volume of stink bugs they had, they crushed stink bugs too. And this particular winery had to dump about 800 gallons of high quality grape juice, because that high quality grape juice also had high quality stink bug. And it was a horrible off flavor. It was an aroma, but yet the off flavor that it imparted into that volume of juice. And rather than go through all the costs and so forth of trying to deal with that juice, they knew of no way to get that stink bug out of it, so they had to dump it. So because of in subsequent years, they've added a supplemental label to things like this pyrethroid I was talking about, this Mustang, which would enable you to be able to spray for the stink bug the day before you harvest it, which would in theory knock all the stink bugs down out of it, so you wouldn't have that invasion of the stink bug into your grape juice. So, but a supplemental label has some particular things that are about it. You've got to define the particular product you're going to use against the particular target pest. And as we talk about labeling, that's one of the things that the label outlines, the particular crop and use of a particular product. And technically, you can't use it for an insect or disease that's not included on that label. So that's why people got into, had to apply for the supplemental label for the particular stink bug situation. I don't know what's happened to stink bugs. I haven't seen as many as, there was a real high population of them there for a couple of years, but I haven't seen as many. I had one on my truck window over the weekend, but that's the only one I've seen. I think it's probably a lot like the things that normally occur in nature. Initially, there was no predator no predatory pressure on the stink bug, and we haven't sprayed enough to reduce the population of them any, but Mother Nature has has found some biological control that has reduced the numbers of them. So, we talked a little bit about the EPA approval process. I can't impress upon you enough about how extensive that is. I've been involved with it, off and on all my days. When I was, I guess it was between I don't remember if it was sophomore, junior year, or junior and senior year at Tech, I had an opportunity to work for a chemical company that was based in England, and they had what was called a miticide that had been approved for use in England, and they wanted to get it labeled in the United States. So they hired me to do field tests that summer. And I had tests in Roanoke. I had some in the northern part of Patrick County. I had some at our house, and then I had some down in the fruit producing areas in the western part of North Carolina. And my weekly task would be to travel through all the sites that we had it tested, and I would provide chemical to the individual growers for them to apply where they had mite populations that were reaching a threshold needing a treatment. And I was to evaluate the effect of the materials and the way that it would control the mites. And about halfway through the summer, I began to notice it was about the time that blackberries were sort of getting a second growth and growing up, and brambles have always been a problem underneath some apple trees. And I happened to notice that there was a negative effect occurring on the blackberry briars under the treated rows. In other words, where they had applied, and I don't remember the name of the material now, but it was a miticide. Wherever they had applied it, it would burn the tender growth, the foliage, the growing shoots of the blackberry briars underneath those trees. And it was consistent whether I was in Roanoke or down in the southwestern part of North Carolina. So when I had to fill out my field reports, I told them that I didn't know how effective it would be as a miticide, but I thought it had potential as a herbicide. I don't think they liked it much, but they never did go forward with a registration on that material, even though it was labeled in England. So that was a side effect that you had to watch. And that was one of the processes that you had to go through that field test. So product labeling is an extensive testing procedure that requires a lot of data. And we've got different types of registrations. They've got, we mentioned the special local need registration. That's what we've got with the stink bug. And then there are other types of registrations that come about. Sometimes they're called emergency registrations, and there may have been one issued actually for that stink bug that particular year, although they didn't know what would kill it at that time. If they were trying to find something because of potential crop damage that would occur. Talked a little bit about the minimal use of pesticides. There's a lot of those that are being tested, and more of them are being found to be being used. And it's because of the general idea of the public not wanting to have pesticides or on their food crops. And the news media are absolutely horrible in my eyes whenever they get wind of a pesticide on a material, on a product. I was looking at a thing online this morning talking about apples, and the gist of the whole thing was talking about the amount of pesticides that have been sprayed on apples, and how much of it may be, in their eyes, left or as a residual material. In other words, at the tolerance. The EPA has determined that it was not above a tolerable level, but the news media was trying to sensationalize it like they do everything else, and trying to say that it was a greater risk to the consuming public. So anything that is ever placed, I don't say anything, but most of the time, anything that ever reaches your grocery store or your table is safe to eat. I've worked with chemicals and pesticides since I was 6 or 7 years old. I started helping them try to get the materials ready when we were spraying apples, and I've handled a lot of it. And, it's only once have I ever been, I think, adversely affected, and that was, I should have been that day. It was a day that real windy, and I was applying a material that was extremely toxic, and it windy, and I got wet. I got sprayed and got wet, so it was one of these organophosphates, and it gave me a headache, and it made me sort of sick for a while. But it didn't take long after I got a shower for it to go away. So there are different classifications of pesticides. We mentioned the one a while ago talking about restricted use. And that is exactly what it means. The use of that is restricted to people that are qualified to handle and use those products by the mechanism of either a private or commercial license. You can also have registered technicians that are under the supervision of a commercial or commercially licensed person, so they can also apply restricted use materials. But one of you now can buy general use material and apply it. I recommend that you read the label. You agreed a while ago that some of you got it and just used it without reading the label, but it's always smart to read the label. There may be some stuff contained on that label that you're not aware of. You find out that it's not good to spray it on your dog food or something of that type. So, we talked about private applicators and commercial applicators, so I won't beat that horse again. But as we talk about a label, there are different parts of a label. There's what we call identifying information. There's precautionary statements. Then there's directions for use. And then the conditions for sale, which includes limitations of warranty and liability. The identifying information is the information that identifies the trade name, the brand, and the product name. And that's all printed on the label itself. And what I'll try to do is bring, I usually bring some labels. And Tom, I may find a few of those and scan them or send them down to you so you can show your folks what the particular parts of a label look like.
Okay.
But in this information statement, we also got what we call an ingredient statement, and that's a statement that gives the active ingredient and the inert or inactive ingredients that are there. And we've already talked about that a little bit today, and it's not rocket science. It's just a thing that you need to be aware of the components that are there. If you get a can of Hot Shot that you're going to have to spray wasp, if you look at that ingredient statement on it, it's going to have a chemical name, whatever it might be, and then the percentage of that active ingredient that is contained in that can. And most of these aerosol cans that you get are gonna have no more than about 0.5% of active ingredient in that can.
So the rest of it's just compressed air.
No, it's going to be inert ingredients. They're going to be, quite often there's some oil-based materials that are in conjunction as carrier, and then there'll be some sort of propellant. It may be compressed air, it may be nitrogen. I don't know. Depends upon the can, the types of things that are doing it. But that's what we're looking at just on a simple can of Hot Shot. And if you go to Lowe's, for example, and you've got a problem with wasps or hornets, always read those statements, because, like everything else, not everything is created equal. Some of those cans may cost you $2.98, and another one over here may cost you $5. But if that $2.98 has a 0.1% pyrethrin, and that $5 one has a 0.75% pyrethrin, that one is 7 times as strong as the other one. So it's going to be potentially a lot more effective. So read the labels. Be able to evaluate what you're purchasing. That's just an example of the type of stuff. In your book, it's got some little snippets on the ingredient statements and so forth, and it's going to have the label's going to tell you the net contents or the net weight. And if you're buying aerosol cans, it's going to tell you how many fluid ounces are there. If you're buying Roundup, Roundup's one of the biggest scams that ever existed in my eyes. You can go to Lowe's and buy ready-to-use Roundup in a quart container with a little aerosol thing. And it's probably probably a 1% solution of Roundup, and they're going to probably charge you $10.
I'm guessing you can make it for half that.
Well, $10 for a quart, say. Then you'll look around a little more, and they'll have an 18%, which is, they tell you, full strength, where you mix your own. And that might be 20%. True Roundup, when it first came out, was a 41.5% material in a gallon. In other words, a gallon of Roundup, you got 41.5% Roundup, and then you got 58.5% of inert ingredient. It may be a mixture of oil or water or whatever. But that gallon, when it first came out, was about $120 for a gallon. And that's what they based all this ready-to-use material on, was that price. But right now I can buy Roundup in a 2.5 gallon jug for $35. The whole jug for $35. So less than 17, $18 a gallon. So Roundup is, they're when you go to Lowe's, you're buying convenience and packaging and things of that type. So that's what you're doing. But it's an interesting deal. It's a marketing deal, and Monsanto's making a killing on the marketing of it. So that's what we're talking about with net contents. On the label also, it's going to tell you the type of pesticide, whether it's a fungicide, insecticide, acaricide, herbicide, fumigant, whatever. That's included on the label. It's going to give you the type of formulation.
Which acaricides kill?
Acarids. Arachnids.
Oh, okay. I was about to say.
Most of the things, Tyler, the definition is held within the word itself.
I'm aware, but I wasn't sure what Carol was referring to.
Arachnid. Spiders. Okay? But that's what we're talking about. The type of formulation would be whether it's a wettable powder or dust, an EC, which stands for emulsifiable concentrate. And there's a whole list of those things. We'll talk about those individually when we get around to it. We talked about this establishment number and registration number. Those are self-explanatory. We've gotten into that. The label is also going to have on it the name and address of the manufacturer. If something were to ever be wrong, you want to be able to track it down, where it came from. It's going to have the precautionary statements, and that's the deal with the signal words, with the danger, poison, danger, warning, and caution. So there's a picture in your textbook of the skull and crossbones. If you ever see that, be really aware of what you're dealing with. Label's also going to have some information on it about first aid, and that is essential. The type of first aid that needs to be administered, if you were to get it on your skin or your clothing, is greatly different than if you were to swallow it. There's things that have occurred over the past several years about people that have inadvertently consumed some pesticide by swallowing. Quite often, people that were not real good producers may have a small quantity of liquid toxic material and that they had left in a big container, or container began to leak or something, and they may have put it in one of Tom's Sundrop bottles.
Oh my.
And someone that's not knowing may have been consuming a Sundrop one day when they were beginning to apply pesticides, and he reaches over and gets a swig out of what he thought was his Sundrop, but yet turned out to be the toxic material. And heaven forbid that ever happen.
Amen.
But it depends upon the type of material that you're dealing with as to what type of first aid you need to give. Some of these materials are caustic to the esophagus and the stomach. So in that situation, you do not want to give first aid that would induce vomiting, because they would burn when they went down. They'd also burn when they came up. So that's an extreme example of the first aid, or the need for the first aid statement. But that can be viable and active. So it gets into a whole lot of these precautionary statements and so forth. Environmental hazards. Most all of these environmental hazard statements tell you that wildlife protection is everybody's responsibility, and don't use or spill the materials near a waterway. Not rocket science. We're at a good point to stop. We'll pick up here on Wednesday and talk about directions of use, and I'll try to get some labels where you guys will have access to them. I want to spend a minute or two on the difference between a product label and an MSDS sheet, or material safety data sheet. Quite a great difference in those, but you need to know what that is. And we'll look at that, and there's a fairly short video that accompanies this chapter that we'll try to look at that on Wednesday also. So, any questions, problems, orders, disorders? Nope. Amanda's ready to bolt. She's already got her car keys in her hand. She got in late, but she wants to leave early, so that's good.
I'm ready to test.
Have a good day.
Bottle.
I thought that would bring it home to you.
Hey, were you able to test rate that tank?
Yes and no.
You were able to get some done?
I got part of it done.